Welcome to episode 44 of Pausing of the Prophets. Today we're looking at Isaiah 5, verses 24 through 25. And Isaiah writes, "Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble, and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account the anger of the Lord has burned against his people, and he has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets. For all this his anger is not spent, but his hand is still stretched out." Dry grass has no defense against fire, and the anger of the Lord is a fire against all those who reject and despise God's word, God's truth, God's good way to live. We must hold on to this truth. Rejecting and despising God's word and what it calls us to ends only in judgment. Despite the judgment that is described, dead bodies lying in the streets, Isaiah says that God's anger is not spent. We need not think that this means that God is experiencing some vengeful raving and just needs time to calm down. No, God's anger is not spent in the same way that his love is not spent. His wrath toward rebellion is as constant as his love toward the repentant. Wrath and love are part of his character. His justice toward sin is what makes him the only God worth trusting. Now, in the context of this passage, we'll see the immediate effect of his anger not being spent, as Isaiah will go on to describe the eventual coming of the Babylonians to judge Jerusalem. But in the grand story of redemption, we also see his anger not being spent as we look to the cross. In Jesus, we see God's perfect love and his perfect judgment poured out. And because the cross is the place where perfect love and justice meet, all of us who are dry grass because of our sin are protected by faith in the blood of Christ from the fire of God's wrath.